Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real privilege and pleasure for me to introduce the discussion today between Jairam Ramesh and Srinath Raghavan. CPR has had a long standing relationship with Mr. Ramesh in his many different roles. We've engaged with him on environment, we've engaged with him in his role as Minister of Rural Development, and now we've engaged with him in his new avatar as a historian. So it's a real privilege to be with him today and to hear about his new book. For everyone who hasn't picked up a copy, here's the book. The copies are outside. Do pick one up. This is, I think, a really very important book. It's a historical dip into one of the most critical phases in India's politics and public administration. And for me, as someone who's a student of public administration, I've always wanted for more on what actually goes on in decision making systems, how decisions are taken, processes, conversations that help you learn about why the Indian state functions the way it does and why it looks the way it does. And there has been very little. So I read this book actually from a slightly different perspective to what many might place on it and found it a really, really important learning. And I'm looking forward to hearing more in the conversation between the two historians on the book. So over to you, Srinath, to lead the conversation.
Well, thank you, Yamini. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this discussion. I'm really delighted to be talking to Jairam Ramesh about this book, which I think it's fair to say is possibly the first proper historical account that we have of a very crucial period in Indian history, which is the 1970s. When I say historical account, in the sense that this book draws on an extensive archive left behind by P.N. Haksar, who's the subject, but it's an archive which throws light, as Yamini alluded to, on a range of things, and then we'll talk about some of those. But I must also sort of begin by, paying my compliments to Jairam for his tenacity in sort of the research. I mean, there's just an extraordinary effort that has gone into the making of this book, not just in terms of Haksar papers themselves, but a number of other things which come into being. And what we also have, very interestingly, is possibly the first serious historical biography of any senior bureaucrat, civil servant in this country who was sort of saw politics at the apex. So, in that sense, maybe I should just start by asking you, we've got many things from the British parliamentary tradition, the Westminster system as it's called. But the one thing we've not got is that opposition leaders sitting and writing biographies, especially of historical figures. You can think of, if you want a very egregious example, Boris Johnson's biography of Churchill is right out there. Even the jokes are not original. But this is a remarkable piece of work. So what drew you to P.N. Haksar in the first place?
Well, first of all, the fact that Mr. Modi won a landslide in 2014 was certainly a very important determinant of my having time to spend in archives, which I may otherwise not have had. I may have written a book, but it certainly wouldn't have been based on deep archival research, not only at the Murthy at the National Archives, but in other archives across the country and abroad. I think the answer to the question why Mr. Haksar is because the late 60s and the 70s were a very turbulent period in Indian politics, and that turbulence spilled over into many economic choices that we ended up making during that period. In Mr. Haksar, I found a person who not only played a pivotal role in the transformation of Indira Gandhi to the iconic figure that we consider her to be, but more importantly, in a most un-Indian-like way, left behind an extraordinary treasure trove of primary material and papers, almost as if he was waiting for somebody to access them and write a history, not only of him, but a history of the times, as it were. So it's a relatively recent period of our history. So whatever we have of the recent period is based on oral recollections, memoirs, journalistic accounts. Indira Malhotra, for example, is a journalistic account, but a very readable journalistic account. Kuldeep Nair, similarly. We have Catherine Frank, who has done a lot of primary research, primary work. But by and large, this period, beginning the mid 60s and maybe extending up to the end 70s, has been ill served by historians. And when I stumbled upon this archive at the Murti, which has been there for a long time, and it has been made use of by many people, including you yourself in your classic book on 1971, I thought that it would be interesting to look at the history of India of that period through the prism of a person who actually played a very influential role in the making of that history.
And I must say that this book is as readable as Catherine Frank or anything else that we have on that period. So that doesn't at all take away from what we have here. So maybe just by way of sort of getting our audience to understand the background to P.N. Haksar's thing, it struck me that in some ways Haksar's rise to eminence in the period from 1967 onwards was a bit surprising, because he had a reasonably unexceptional career as a diplomat. And in fact, you yourself quote Haksar as saying in one letter to Mrs. Gandhi, when they are talking about something, saying that I am not part of the Indian civil service. In fact, I do not belong to any of the civil services unions within this country. Right? And even as a foreign service officer, he was basically picked up by Jawaharlal Nehru from the bar at Allahabad, and then brought in, served as Deputy High Commissioner in London, in a couple of other places like Nigeria, none of which were sort of really extraordinarily sort of promising postings. And by the time he is, called upon by Indira Gandhi to serve as her sort of secretary in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, he says that, my retirement is nearing. So here you have a person who suddenly sort of catapulted into a very powerful position. So what explains that sudden elevation?
Well, it's absolutely right. He would have ended his career had Indira Gandhi not become Prime Minister as either High Commissioner in London or at most Ambassador to the USSR. I think these were the only two positions he would have held had Mrs. Gandhi not been Prime Minister. But then, of course, things moved differently. There are multiple reasons why Mrs. Gandhi plucks him from diplomatic obscurity, as it were. I think she had an extraordinarily personal relationship with him going back to the mid-30s. The fact that he and Firoz Gandhi were very close, the fact that he, Firoz Gandhi, and a young Indira Nehru formed a threesome in the London of the 1930s and were fellow acolytes of Krishna Menon, along with a whole host of others like Mohan Kumar Mangalam, Bhupesh Gupta, Indrajit Gupta, K.T. Chandy, and so on and so forth, S.S. Dhawan, Shelvankar, another very important figure. So I think her relationship with him goes back to the 30s. He was a local guardian to Rajiv Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi between 1965 and 1967, when both of Indira Gandhi's sons were studying in England. He was, as you say, he was taken out from the bar and recruited into the Ministry of External Affairs in 1947 on the recommendation of Tej Bahadur Sapru. And Nehru always had a fondness for him. And there's extensive correspondence between Nehru, Girija Shankar Bajpai on the one side, and Nehru and C.D. Deshmukh on the other, when Mr. Haksar had almost decided to quit the Foreign Service in 52, and Nehru is going out of his way to retain Mr. Haksar. It shows that Mr. Nehru had a lot of fondness and respect for Mr. Haksar. Well, Nigeria, in today's scheme of things, would be a punishment posting for a Foreign Service officer. But in 1960, it was, the heyday of India's involvement with Africa. It was the first embassy that was being opened actually at that level. And Nehru had started a few years earlier, had persuaded Delhi University to start a Department of African Studies. So Nehru was extraordinarily caught up with Africa, and his choice of Haksar was deliberate. It was not an accidental choice. And in fact, there is a letter from Subimal Dutt to Haksar. It's extraordinary that the Foreign Secretary is writing to an IFS officer saying, you've been personally selected for the Nigeria posting. His second posting was also quite nondescript by today's standards. he was posted to Vienna as our ambassador. But the real reason, which I have tried to explain, is that it was not so much the diplomatic posting to Vienna as much as the International Atomic Energy Agency posting, which was very important, because both Bhabha and Ramanna, and there are letters from Bhabha and Ramanna which I have quoted, reveal the fact that India was trying to establish a new relationship with the IAEA, and they saw in Mr. Haksar a person who, but incidentally, had a scientific background, science background, and so on and so forth. So it is, it's a long culmination, Srinath, a personal relationship, a definite left of center ideology. Indira Gandhi, when she becomes Prime Minister on the 24th of January 1966, followed what in today's language would be called market economics. Her economic advisors were L.K. Jha, Ashok Mehta, P.C. Bhattacharya, who was governor of the Reserve Bank of India, I.G. Patel, who was the chief economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, and B.K. Nehru, who was then our ambassador in Washington. And as you know, the traumatic decision that she was forced to take on the 6th of June 1966, which was the devaluation of the Indian rupee, was something that the Congress party had opposed violently, including Mr. Kamaraj, who was the Congress president, but she went ahead and took it on the advice of economists and some of her advisors, and she was pilloried for it. And then she goes into the election in 1967, and the Congress party faces a debacle. It's interesting how the meaning of the word debacle changes in 50 years. Indira Gandhi gets 282 seats in 1967, and it is considered to be a debacle. Narendra Modi gets 282 seats in 2014, and is considered to be a sweep. So 50 years, our notion of numbers also undergo a change. So she realizes that she has to make a major change, and that's when she gets L.K. Jha out to the Reserve Bank. But right from the day she became Prime Minister, she had her eyes on Mr. Haksar. She goes to meet President Johnson in March of 1966. Her team includes L.K. Jha, G. Patel, C.S. Jha, who was then the Foreign Secretary, and of course B.K. Nehru, who is our ambassador. And yet, Srinath, she writes to the Deputy High Commissioner in London saying, "Dear PNH, I want you to be with me on my visit to Washington." And the Deputy High Commissioner to London joins the Prime Minister of India on her first official visit to the United States. So it shows that right from the beginning, she had her eyes on him. And I think she had her eyes on him, as I said, for two reasons. One, she was more than convinced that he would be loyal to Indira Gandhi, the person, and of course, he would give unvarnished advice to Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister. So I think it was a confluence of the personal loyalty and a certain definite ideology. Mrs. Gandhi was not ideological, but if at all, she had an ideology, it was what you would loosely call Fabian socialism. And of course, Mr. Haksar was left of Fabian socialism as well. I think these are some of the reasons why he becomes her secretary in May of 1967.
Right. And it's also interesting that the sort of early period, when he comes in, is the time when the sort of the young Turks within the Congress party are pushing this kind of socialist 10-point program, and then leading up in about a year plus time to the stray thoughts that he sort of sends to the ICC. And how important do you think Haksar was in articulating this kind of leftward turn, which was, of course, there was a politics to it of that period, which you bring out very beautifully, which is to say that, there is a personal struggle for power which is happening within the Congress party between the old guard and Indira Gandhi. But in a sense, you seem to suggest that Haksar's role was to sort of give it an ideological cast and present it as somehow beyond this thing. One of the things which I was particularly intrigued to see was, you treat the episode when Morarji Desai is being eased out, And you point out that actually Morarji Desai was not the person, it was actually Vaibhi Chavan whom she wanted to go after, but in a sense, Morarji Bhai became the sort of proxy in that thing. But Haksar played an important role in giving a wider sort of framework and construction to this. So could you just talk a little bit about
Well, Srinath, if there is one historical nugget that I can claim credit for, it is this point that you made, because no historian has made this point. They've always believed that Indira Gandhi was at loggerheads with Morarji Desai. And what I believe from the primary evidence is that the real target of Indira Gandhi was Vaibhi Chavan. Because Vaibhi Chavan had betrayed her in the Congress Parliamentary Board and supported Sanjeeva Reddy's candidature as President of India. She was livid with Chavan. She wanted to get rid of Chavan as Home Minister at that time, but it was Mr. Haksar who prevailed upon her. The reason why he prevailed upon her was Mr. Chavan was in the lead in the Congress party, calling for nationalization of banks, calling for the abolition of privy purses and princely privileges. And Mr. Haksar tells Indira Gandhi, if you want to convert a battle of personalities with Nijlingappa into a battle of ideas, it would be ironical if you are going to get rid of a man who is actually calling for progressive ideas. So Morarji Desai actually becomes collateral damage, and he was not the primary target of Indira Gandhi at all. In that period, 66, 67, 68, Indira Gandhi was very cautious and tentative. She allowed the party bosses, the syndicate, to rule for most of the time. But it is the Sanjeeva Reddy episode that transforms Indian politics. Zakir Hussain dies. Sanjeeva Reddy is seen to be a man who will, make life uncomfortable for Indira Gandhi. And Kamaraj and the other party bosses, Atulya Ghosh, Nijlingappa, want Sanjeeva Reddy. Mrs. Gandhi wants Jagjeevan Ram. And there is this battle. Finally, Sanjeeva Reddy becomes the president candidate. He is actually a candidate who goes against the wishes of the Prime Minister. She calls for conscience voting, and then Vivi Giri, and then history changes. I think Mr. Haksar's key contribution was to tell Indira Gandhi, in the series of notes that he left behind in his archives, that convert this battle of personalities into a battle of ideas. In fact, the drafts that she was getting to Nijlingappa's letters from C. Subramaniam were all oriented towards attacking Nijlingappa, the person. And Mr. Haksar changes all those drafts into attacking the ideas that Nijlingappa was espousing, which is close the public sector, stop this control on monopoly houses, bring in foreign investment. So Nijlingappa in many ways was an early Manmohan Singh. In 1991, he was advocating what Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh did in the post-crisis years. And Haksar tells Mrs. Gandhi, and the stray thoughts note is the first evidence of that don't make this a battle of people, because Nijlingappa, senior figure, Gandhian and so on, but make it a battle of ideas. And of course, in that, there was this Young Turks. And there was this ginger group in the Congress party called the Congress Forum of Socialist Action, which had people like Chandrasekhar, Mohan Daria, Arjun Arora, Krishan Kant, who later became Vice President of India, and of course they had an old Turk guiding the Young Turk, which is Keshavdev Malavya and Gulzari Lal Nanda. So it was a very important ginger group within the Congress party. It was inaugurated in 1962 by Nehru himself. But then, it lay dormant after Nehru's death. So in 69, Srinath, on the 12th of July 1969 to be precise, Indian politics undergoes a cataclysmic change. That's the day in which Indira Gandhi and Haksar decide that they need to unleash their arsenal, their ideological arsenal, to deal with the reactionary elements epitomized by Nijlingappa, Sanjeev Reddy and so on. Till the 12th of July 1969, neither Mr. Haksar nor Mrs. Gandhi advocated nationalization of banks. It is between the 12th of July 1969 and the 19th of July 1969 that nationalization accelerates and the announcement is made on the 19th of July. That is the first bugle call. Then, of course, you have the abolition of princely privileges, land reforms, public sector, and so on and so forth. So, Mr. Haksar, in that period, is crucial.
So one impression that you can get, partly because the book is drawing so heavily on Mr. Haksar's own papers, is and a lot of the material is about what he tells Mrs. Gandhi and so on. So in a sense, you can get a sense that here is this man who's kind of telling the Prime Minister, training her in many ways. But at least on a couple of issues, it struck me that Mrs. Gandhi is actually the one who's taking the lead. For instance, bank nationalization, as you point out. I mean, Haksar was only an advocate of social control over the banking sector. It is actually, and you say that he was literally coming up to speed overnight when he summons this young officer from the state bank to sort of explain things to him and so on. The other instance where I thought, which you brought out, which is very striking, is the decision to advance the elections in 1971. Because you produce a note here where she tells him, if I want to call for an early election, what are the 3 steps I need to take constitutionally? Just tell me that. And that's when he replies, of course, with a press note, with the whole thing, right? I mean, so in a sense, he's very, once he understands what the Prime Minister wants, he gives the works.
It's very difficult without access to Indira Gandhi's papers. I could be accused of making the economist's mistake of mistaking correlation for causation, so it's quite possible that line could be taken. But I suspect in most of these cases, it was Mr. Haksar who was driving Mrs. Gandhi into decision making. Because Mrs. Gandhi still in 1969, as I said, was cautious, was tentative. But you're right. The decision to advance the election was not taken by Indira Gandhi alone. It was taken by a cabal. That cabal had Kumaramangalam, it had C. Subramaniam, it had Mr. P. N. Haksar. But the exact date was determined because in the draft he leaves the date blank, and that date is actually filled by Indira Gandhi. Yes, this is a problem with writing an archival biography based on archives of one individual. There is no way I could cross-check this with what Indira Gandhi was thinking. All I could do was correlate Mr. Haksar's notes with the decisions taken by Indira Gandhi, and I found a one-to-one correspondence. The final letter to Nijlingappa is exactly the draft that Mr. Haksar gives her. The stray thoughts note was exactly the note. Now, there are some places where Indira Gandhi does make contributions, and to the extent that I have been able to find that out, I have indicated. But, I would say, without hesitation, Srinath, that Mrs. Gandhi, till March 71, was very much driven by Mr. Haksar. March 71 marks a decisive break. After March 71, Mrs. Gandhi becomes her own individual.
Except that maybe that date is also significant in a sense that that's the onset of the Bangladesh crisis.
Yes.
And there again you show that Mr. Haksar in some ways was the person who was able to pull these various strands of activity which were going on within the government of India. And played a very important role.
Chandrasekhar Dasgupta has a wonderful phrase to describe what Mr. Haksar did. He calls this the grand design of 1971. You have also talked about it in your book, and Chandrasekhar Dasgupta has also written about it. One of the great myths propagated by one of the most colorful Indian personalities, Field Marshal Manekshaw. One of the great myths is that Indira Gandhi was keen to attack in March, and Manekshaw, held her back. The reality, based on written material, is that Jayaprakash Narayan, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, K. Subramaniam, these were the guys who were advocating quick military action, but the diplomatic, certainly Mr. Kao, Mr. Haksar, and Mrs. Gandhi herself, very cautious, wanting to exhaust the diplomatic options, wanting to exhaust all the foreign policy options and the political options. Yesterday I was having lunch with Rehman Sobhan, who is quoted in this book. And Rehman Sobhan told me something which I don't have in the book because there's no written piece of paper on that. He told me that he meets Mr. Haksar on the 1st of April in the residence of Ashok Mitra, 1971. And Rehman Soban was the first Bangladeshi high official Mr. Haksar and Mr. Kao had met. And they didn't know who Tajuddin was. And Mr. Haksar asked Rehman Soban whether he has a photograph of Tajuddin Ahmad, because Tajuddin was going to see them a few days later, and they wanted to make sure that it was the real Tajuddin and not a fraudulent Tajuddin. I mean, so in 71, contrary to the Manekshaw thesis, the political establishment and the diplomatic establishment was certainly very cautious about launching a military offensive early on. And later on, of course, things pick up.
So, 1971 is also the year, when, as you say in this book, Haksar is kind of more or less reaching the end of his tether. I think, the pressures of the job are getting onto him. He is already roped in Professor P.N. Dhar to be his successor, which is again a very unusual choice. An economist who teaches at the Delhi school is being sort of bought in to become
Right wing.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. In a sense, more sort of on the market end of the spectrum, is being bought in to take over the job of another person who came from a very different background. So at a minimum, I think we should give Mrs. Gandhi some credit for having the sort of vision to choose people from very, very diverse backgrounds and bring them together in a secretariat. Right?
Srinath, what is not known and what comes out in this book is that Mr. Haksar actually retires from service on the 4th of September 1971. He turns 58, he retires from service and goes on 2 months leave preparatory to retirement the day before. He goes to Geneva, he goes to Paris, he goes to Moscow, he goes to London, he goes to Warsaw. It was not just leave. I think there was some super secret diplomacy going on, because I have mentioned the fact that he meets the Prime Minister of Poland. And Poland is important because Poland plays a very important role in the Security Council in December. So there was something going on, and I think he meets the Soviets as well, although there is no written evidence of that. However, what happens when he retires officially on the 4th of September 1971 and he leaves? Mrs. Gandhi has to go to these 6 capitals. She has to go to Vienna, Brussels, London, Washington, Paris, and Bonn, the famous 6-nation visit. And she recalls Mr. Haksar and says that I want you to be with me. And Mr. Haksar then joins her, including, of course, the famous meeting with Nixon on the 4th of November 1971, all while being on leave. Technically, he is not secretary to Prime Minister when Indira Gandhi and Haksar meet Kissinger and Nixon in the White House. He is on leave. It is only on the 4th of December 1971, when Pakistan has attacked us the previous evening, that orders appointing him as Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister are issued. So he had been planning his departure right from March, April 1971. And there is a letter from him to D.P. Dhar, which he writes to D.P. Dhar. D.P. Dhar was in Moscow. In May of 1971, he writes, "My dear Durga, I'm getting tired. I don't think I am the man for the next phase of Indira Gandhi." So he has seen the writing on the wall. He has seen the emergence of Sanjay Gandhi as in power. He also knows that an Indira Gandhi with a 2/3 majority with her own is not the Indira Gandhi of 1969 and 71. So in May 71, he has actually decided. And then D.P. Dhar writes back to him, and that solves the mystery of why Mr. Haksar stayed back. D.P. Dhar writes back to him saying, "I have talked to our friends Aruna, Nurul, Nikhil, GP." This is the left lobby in India at that time. Aruna Asaf Ali, Nikhil Chakravarti, G. Parsarthi, and they obviously prevailed upon Haksar not to, because he was the patron saint of the left. I mean, there's no running away from it. He was an unrepentant Marxist. He was a member of the Communist Party of India. He was a secretary of the CPI 1942 to 1943. And, he prided himself on his communist and Marxist links.
So maybe that's a good point to sort of ask for your judgments about his economic policies, which Mr. Haksar sort of favored while he was in office. In a sense, that period is also seen as a period when you have sort of increasing levels of controls being imposed on the Indian economy by a range of sort of legislative and other policy decisions. It is also a period when, as you point out, Mr. Haksar is very keen on the public sector kind of taking over many things, right? And there's this letter which you write, which you quote, where someone writes to him saying, so and so private scooter manufacturer wants more sort of capacity expansion licenses, and he says, why should the private sector be doing it? The public sector should be doing it, right? But you say on some other things like the Maruti, which we'll just set aside for a time being because I want to talk about Sanjay Gandhi, he is not so this thing. And to me, the most striking thing was that, what kind of a judgment can we reach on his policies, right? I think the conventional judgment would be that, listen, this was a sort of a socialist phase, these were misguided policies and so on. But a letter that you quote by him, to me, suggests a slightly different way of thinking about it, right? At one point he says, while we are striving for democratic socialism in this country, we should not end up building state capitalism. Yeah. And I wonder whether the problem for that period was really that we did not build state capitalism. The East Asian economies managed to do exactly that, right? And they did it by disciplining the private sector. Here, the commanding heights were in your control. So why did people like Mr. Haksar fail to impose? And you quote a letter, an appraisal that he writes, an obituary, practically, for Mohan Kumar Mangalam in 1975, where he says that the public sector has completely failed, and a lot of the failure is that of management, etc. So what is the overall assessment there?
Well, Srinath, I'm not a judgmental biographer. Okay, I believe judgmental biography. I leave it to others to do psychobiography, judgmental biography. I'm a narrative biographer, and I'm a biographer that does not believe in taking the benefit of hindsight and saying this was right, that was wrong. I don't do that. I've eschewed that. But in the end, knowing that a lot of people will ask this question, I tried to say, make some assessment based on today's, because I don't think you can divorce people from the historical context of their times, the political context in which they are operating. To say that he was pro-USSR, for example, it made a lot of sense given the geopolitics of that time, and given the policies of Nixon and Kissinger towards India. So I'm not being judgmental. However, it is true that Mr. Haksar was a great believer, not just a believer. He was a defender, he was a proponent, he was an evangelist as far as the public sector was concerned. And this evangelism served the country well in some areas, did not serve the country well in some other areas, with the benefit of hindsight. With the benefit of hindsight, ONGC was a tremendous success. With the benefit of hindsight, IPCL, which got privatized, was a tremendous success. Steel Authority of India was a tremendous success. But with the benefit of hindsight, Scooters India was an abysmal failure. So when you do the judgment, there is a plus side and there is a minus side. Was he a doctrinaire Marxist? No. Because what he is saying is that, in fact, his obituary on the public sector is very interesting. He is castigating the Congress party and the left parties for destroying the public sector. The trade unions, he is criticizing the trade unions for destroying the public sector. And he, in that article, and in one note to Mrs. Gandhi, going back to 1968, he uses a phrase which is an anathema to any Marxist or any socialist or any left economist. He says public sector should run profitably and commercially. In 1968. So, I believe that our failure to build state capitalism, as you very well put it, stemmed from the fact that the public sector got hijacked by the political parties, by all political parties. At that time, of course, most political parties were left of center. And it was a combination of the political control and the bureaucratic, backseat driving that completely destroyed the public sector. The Steel Authority of India is a classic example. In 1973, it gets set up. In 1972, Mr. Haksar and Mr. Mohan Kumar Mangalam, the archpriests of left-wing ideology, recruit an executive from the Tata Group to be the first chairman of the Steel Authority of India. Of course, I should say, in interest of full disclosure, that that executive of the Tata Group had been a member of the CPI in the early 1940s, M.A. Wadud Khan, and he had been a communist worker. But subsequently, he had realized the folly of his ways and joined the Tatas. And he had become a big executive of the Tata Group. And they reached out to Wadud Khan. And one of the great tragedies of Indira Gandhi and one of the great tragedies of India was that Mr. Kumaramangalam died in May 1973. And with the death of Mohan Kumaramangalam, Mr. Wadud Khan becomes a complete passenger. And then he leaves. So, one final point. In 1973 and in 1974, in 1973, his years of power are over. He is without an office. He keeps seeing Indira Gandhi. He is her special envoy, but no position. In 1974, same thing. He comes back to the Planning Commission only in January of 75. Not 73, 74. In 74 and 75, a chief economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance sends him two long papers called Current Economic Situation, Problems and Remedies. And both these papers, in many ways, herald the liberalization. The chief economic advisor is calling for market-determined exchange rates. The chief economic advisor is calling for greater import liberalization. The chief economic advisor is calling for lesser control on monopoly houses. Dr. Manmohan Singh, now, the politics of the 1970s precluded many of Manmohan Singh's ideas in the mid-70s from seeing the light of day. Now, it's a fascinating question. Should Mr. Haksar have staked everything on Manmohan Singh's ideas? After all, Manmohan Singh was his protege. He brought him into the government and made him chief economic advisor in 1972. But there is a lot of correspondence between Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Haksar. There's a lot of discussion. But the recommendations for economic liberalization in the mid-70s really don't see the light of day for another 15, 20 years. So that may well have been a missed bus. And from the point of view of today, Mr. Haksar can certainly be accused of being too dirigist in his economic approach.
No, I think the book also, in fairness, points out how complicated some of this overlap between ideological and policy choices could be, right? For instance, one of the most controversial decisions of 1973 was wheat nationalization.
Yes.
And you say that both Haksar and Mohan Kumaramangalam opposed it, right?
That's very important, very important. Haksar opposed wheat nationalization, the wholesale trade in wheat. Mr. Kumaramangalam, Haksar was not a member of the cabinet then, but Kumaramangalam was a member of the cabinet. And it's extraordinary that the champion of nationalization of wheat was D.P. Dhar and Shugomai Chakravarti. D.P. Dhar providing the leadership and Shugomai Chakravarti providing the economic rationale. So there were multiple forces at work, Srinath, in the mid-70s.
Well, the other point where I think people will be quite interested in is reading your account of the sort of famous Yashpal Kapoor case which came up before the Allahabad High Court, where Mr. Haksar was asked to depose, and it seems that either he misrepresented the facts or got the facts himself wrong.
I think he was guilty of perjury.
So
he was guilty of perjury.
Yeah. And that episode also seems to have marked some kind of a breaking point between him and Indira Gandhi, because Indira Gandhi seems to have felt that he let her down by his testimony.
Yeah, I think that's a very important episode. People forget that Raj Narayan went to the Allahabad High Court in 1971, in May of 1971, charging Indira Gandhi of 6 corrupt practices. And Justice Jagmohan Sinha, in his judgment of the 12th of June 1975, upheld only 2 of the 6 charges. She was exonerated on 4 out of the 6. Now, what are the 2 charges Indira Gandhi was held guilty of, and for which the emergency had to be imposed? The first charge: the state government of UP put up the rostrum and provided the microphone for her meeting in Raebareli. Extraordinary. Today, when prime ministers go to any state, is the state government that puts up the all the dais, the mics. The state government that does it. But she was held guilty of the first charge. Second thing she was held guilty of, her election agent, Yashpal Kapoor, submitted his resignation on the 14th of January 1971. He submitted his resignation to Mr. Haksar. Mr. Haksar, according to his own testimony, accepted the resignation orally, but in the files of the PMO, the letter was acceptance date was shown as 27th of January 1971. So Raj Narayan's charge was, Justice Jagmohan Sinha's argument was, Yashpal Kapoor got government salary for a period of 13 days, which goes against all government rules, therefore she should be unseated. This was. Now, Mr. Haksar goes to the Allahabad High Court. He is cross-questioned by Prashant Bhushan's father, who was then the lawyer for Raj Narayan. And Mr. Haksar says, well, he resigned on the 14th. I accepted it orally. So then the lawyer says, is it normal for appointments to be made orally? So Mr. Haksar says, yes, I was appointed orally. And my written order came much later after I joined. Okay? I think, frankly, the evidence shows that he was protecting Indira. So he was doing a lot of gymnastics. And that there was already bad blood between Sanjay Gandhi and Indira Gandhi. I think his testimony in Allahabad in February of 1975. And remember, it is this testimony that crucifies Indira Gandhi. It is one of the two charges against Indira Gandhi. I think that really completely queers the pitch. And that is responsible for his house being raided twice, or income tax raids. It is responsible for the Pandit brothers raid in Connaught Place, and by then the relationship has completely broken down.
So that's a good point to talk about Sanjay Gandhi and this thing. And then, before we come to Sanjay Gandhi, it strikes me that Haksar had such different sets of relationship with Rajiv and Sanjay Gandhi, right?
Different, completely.
I mean, you quote a letter that he sends to Sonia Gandhi after Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, where he says, what a misfortune or tragedy that a father should have to attend a son's funeral, right? So that is how he saw his relationship with Rajiv Gandhi. Whereas with Sanjay Gandhi, as you point out, right from the word go, from the time he was interning with the Rolls-Royce factory in England in the late 60s, things seem to have come unstuck.
Absolutely.
What do you think were the main factors?
Well, Rajiv, I must say, used him in 1987 when he goes to China with V.V. Paranjpe and begins the process of reconciliation, which then culminates in the historic visit of Mr. Gandhi to Beijing in December of 88. So Rajiv used him. He consulted him on many matters, but on the matter of China, he actually gave him an active role in May of 1987, and the records are quite revealing in this regard. I think the problem with Sanjay Gandhi goes back to the 60s. Sanjay Gandhi was in Rolls-Royce College. It was a 4-year program. He wanted to quit after 2 years. Indira Gandhi tells Haksar, please convince Sanjay to complete the 4 years because nobody will give him a job if he comes back after 2 years. Mr. Haksar goes and tries to convince Sanjay Gandhi. Sanjay Gandhi is very upset. He writes a letter to his mother, and I was able to get a copy of that letter. He writes a letter to his mother saying that Mr. Haksar came and met me. He doesn't listen to me at all. He wants me to complete all the 4 years, but I have nothing to learn. I've learned all that I have to learn, and I'm coming back. So from then, he had built a relationship with Rajiv. He writes to Indira Gandhi, Rajiv is a fine artistic young boy. He came and we spent hours talking of many matters, mice and men. But with Sanjay, I have yet to begin. But Urmila and I will make a conscious effort to go and meet him. But to give him the impression that we look upon him in his own right and not as the son of our friend, as far as Sanjay Gandhi is concerned. But of course, the real issue was in 1968 when Sanjay Gandhi unveils the ambition to be the Henry Ford of India and produce this people's car. So from December 68 onwards, Mr. Haksar is on a collision course with the Prime Minister. He is working with the Prime Minister on every issue. The Prime Minister is listening to him on every issue except on one. And on that one issue, he tells the Prime Minister two things. He tells the Prime Minister in December 68, India does not require passenger cars. India already has 3 passenger car manufacturers, Ambassador, Premier and Standard. What India requires is an efficient public transport system. And what India requires is millions and millions of scooters, manufactured, of course, in the public sector. That's the ideological objection to what Mr. Gandhi was doing. But the second thing is what finally crucified him in 1972. The second thing which he tells Mrs. Gandhi, Prime Minister's son cannot stay in the Prime Minister's house and carry on a business with, quote unquote, less than desirable characters. And this goes back to Sanjay Gandhi. And from 68 onwards, I think the knives are out. In fact, in 1970, in September of 1970, the letter of intent to manufacture Maruti cars is given to Sanjay Gandhi, and it is extraordinary that the cabinet papers for this did not go through Mr. Haksar, who was then the secretary to the Prime Minister. It did not go to Mr. Haksar. It went from Dinesh Singh, who was then the Minister for Industry. It went directly to Mrs. Gandhi. It came to the cabinet, and the cabinet approved. And all this is on record. I'm not saying anything, making up any story. It's all there on the record. So in 1970, I think the relationship had broken down, and after 71, when Indira Gandhi emerges as a leader in her own right, after she's hailed as Empress of India by The Economist, and in December, the Empress of India becomes Durga, courtesy Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, so she doesn't see the need for Mr. Haksar. Frankly, Mr. Haksar, I think, had outlived his utility by 1972.
Just one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. In some ways, could you argue that P.N. Haksar created the conditions for his own downfall, not just because of his particular attitudes towards this thing? Because there's one point of criticism which you make in the conclusion. As you say, throughout the biography, very non-judgmental. There's a lot of material in there for others to make their judgments, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of that you will hear from people in the coming months. But the one point which you make is that in some ways, Haksar was the one who encouraged Indira Gandhi to downgrade the importance of the organization of the Congress party and create conditions where someone like Sanjay Gandhi could emerge and the Youth Congress could emerge as an alternative sort of center of power by the time you're talking of 1976. And in that sense, I mean, history seems to have caught up with him, right?
Absolutely right. I think he was a great believer in a committed bureaucracy, great believer in a committed judiciary, but he wrote about this in 1973. I only wish he'd written about it in 1968 so that people knew what commitment meant. He talked of commitment to constitution, commitment to values, commitment to secularism, commitment to integrity, morality. However, in the hands of people less ideologically committed and men of lesser integrity than Haksar, this became a recipe for sycophancy. I mean, the best example I can give, the analogy I can give is of Mahatma Gandhi. If there is one man who brought religion into Indian politics, it is Mahatma Gandhi. But in Mahatma Gandhi's hands, religion and politics became an elevating experience. But in the hands of Mr. Bal Thackeray, or in the hands of Yogi Adityanath, religion and politics becomes a recipe for destruction. So same thing happened, in my view, same thing happened in the case of Mr. Haksar. He had the integrity, he had the personal honesty, and he had the personal relationship with Indira Gandhi not to be a sycophant. And making the Congress party Indira-centric, which he did, by the way. I mean, he certainly made it Indira Gandhi-centric. As long as people Mrs. Gandhi, the tragedy of Mrs. Gandhi, in the space of 5 months, 3 people who were closest to her, who could have told her that she was doing wrong, and still survived, 2 die and 1 exits. 15th of January 73, Mr. Haksar leaves. 28th of February 1973, Pitambar Pant dies, another great figure who's not been written about much in Indian history by Indian historians. And on the 31st of May 1973, Kumaramangalam dies in an air crash. So in the space of 5 months, Mrs. Gandhi loses. And there's a wonderful letter from Indira Gandhi to Dorothy Norman, where she is recalling, the fact this happened in this 5 months. So in the hands of a D.K. Barua, India is Indra, Indra is India. I think Haksar also believed India is Indra, Indra is India, but he didn't articulate it that way. He could tell Indira Gandhi, sometimes Indira, you're not India. But for D.K. Barua, India is India, Indianism became a 24/7 mantra. So, Srinath, you're absolutely right, and that's what I've ended by saying, that commitment was fine when it came to people with values, people with ideology, people with integrity. But to assume that you will always have people of Haksar's values and Haksar's integrity is a bit unrealistic. And soon you had the R.K. Dhavans of the world, and you had the D.K. Baruas of the world, and you had the Arjun Singhs of the world, in whose hands what Mr. Haksar had contemplated became everything oriented towards one individual.
So, I think on that note,